In this war, men have attacked the enemy from the front, from behind, from the air, and from the sea, and this week they attacked them from beneath the earth.
In 1917, Britain's Allied forces prepared an assault on Germany after years of grinding war, a 3-year conflict whose gains were measured in feet instead of miles. This time, however, would differ. Beneath the battlefield, Britain's secret weapon crawled through tunnels towards enemy lines. If it worked, it would split the earth and swallow the enemy.
This underground war was almost a different war from that of 1914. It was a war of moles, rats, and cave dwellers.
The plan was so secret that officers marched with a riddle. Gentlemen, I don't know whether we are going to make history tomorrow, but at any rate we shall change geography. A bulge deep into trouble. By 1917, the Great War had collapsed into a long and brutal stalemate. For 3 years, the Western Front had barely shifted, stretching roughly 400 miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. The rapid breakthroughs the Allied powers had expected at the war's outset dissolved into static trench warfare, where millions of soldiers died for gains measured in yards rather than miles. Nowhere was this grim reality more concentrated than in Belgium at the Ypres salient, a narrow, blood-soaked pocket of Allied territory. In military terms, a salient is a projection into enemy-held territory that is exposed on multiple sides. The Ypres salient fits this definition perfectly, a bulge in the British lines that extended into German-controlled territory around the city of Ypres. Its strategic importance was undeniable, but so was its cost. German forces surrounded the salient from the north, east, and south, subjecting the men inside to constant, converging artillery fire. Every road, trench, and movement lay under enemy observation. Reinforcements, supply runs, and even routine survival became deadly risks, as German guns could strike almost anywhere at will. The land itself offered no refuge. What had once been fertile farmland of fields, villages, and open meadows had been pulverized by shellfire and rain. The soil dissolved into a choking sea of mud, deep enough to trap and drown men. Trenches flooded and collapsed, turning into mass graves for the wounded and exhausted. Yet even this devastation was secondary to a greater strategic threat, the high ground. South of the salient rose the Messines Ridge, a 10-mile arc of elevated terrain seized by German forces in 1914. From this commanding position, German observers could survey the entire southern sector of the salient. Supply routes, troop movements, and attack preparations were all visible, allowing German artillery to strike with devastating precision. This single advantage made any major offensive from the salient nearly suicidal. Thousands of men could be committed to an assault, only for a handful to return, having gained little more than the ground their comrades lay buried beneath. Still, the British High Command understood that remaining pinned in place was not an option. Breaking out of the Ypres salient was essential. A successful advance would open the path north toward the Belgian coast, where German U-boat bases threatened Allied shipping and supply lines. It would also relieve pressure on French forces fighting further south. Achieving these goals, however, required a plan unlike anything attempted before, one that would not assault the ridge head-on, but instead strike from below, carving a path to victory deep beneath the earth itself. An under-front line of Allied miners. From the earliest stages of modern warfare and throughout the Great War, tunneling was used to break the deadlock and avoid costly frontal assaults. As 19th-century battlefield tactics failed against machine guns and massed artillery, British High Command turned to a far older method of war, the siege. If the German lines could not be crossed, they would be undermined. Military tunneling was not a new invention, but the plan at Messines would be unprecedented in its scale and ambition. Engineers and soldiers would carve vast tunnel systems beneath no man's land, using them to conduct surprise raids and to place explosives under enemy trenches, supply depots, and communication lines to destroy entire defensive positions in a single strike. Among the Allied powers, Britain possessed the greatest experience and determination in underground warfare. Recruitment efforts shifted away from traditional enlistment centers and into the coalfields of Britain, drawing on miners whose expertise in working underground was essential. Planning for large-scale subterranean operations intensified during the winter of 1915. In September of that year, Brigadier George Foch, Engineer-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, proposed driving deep mine galleries 60 to 90 feet below German positions. Shallow tunnels, he warned, were too easily detected and destroyed. Overall command of this underground campaign fell to General Herbert Plumer, commander of the British Second Army. Known for his caution and concern for his troops, Plumer favored careful preparation over reckless assaults. In January 1916, he presented his plan to Field Marshal Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force. Rather than treating mining as a supporting tactic, Plumer proposed building the entire offensive around it. Tunneling companies would push deeper than ever before, cutting through soft clay and waterlogged soil to reach directly beneath key German strongpoints along the Messines ridge. Explosives would be placed under dugouts, command posts, and defensive positions. When detonated, they would shatter the ridge from within, triggering the Battle of Messines and disrupting German defenses. The explosions would clear the way for an infantry advance to seize the ridge and the villages of Messines and Wetschede. Haig approved the plan. By early 1916, the most ambitious mining operation of the war was underway. Over the following year, British forces created a hidden front line beneath the battlefield. Miners and soldiers worked side by side in darkness, advancing silently beneath enemy feet. Armed with picks, braces, and dim candlelight, they relied on a technique known as clay kicking, borrowed from civilian tunneling and ideally suited to the blue clay of Belgium. It was slow, exhausting, and dangerous work carried out far below the surface of the war. But what was life like inside these tunnels? You would need explosives to build bat caves in Belgium. With General Plumer's radical plan approved in early 1916, a deceptive quiet fell over the Messines front. The real battle was not on the surface, but dozens of feet below, where the Royal Engineer tunneling companies embarked on the war's most ambitious underground project. This was a war fought in near-total darkness, a silent, methodical crawl toward a single, catastrophic moment. The men who descended into the shafts were a breed apart. They were hardened civilian miners accustomed to the claustrophobic, damp, and dark conditions that this new phase of warfare demanded. Recognizing their specialist skills, the army paid them 6 shillings a day, a king's ransom compared to the 1 shilling earned by an infantryman. They were worth every penny. Their primary excavation method, known as clay kicking, was a silent, choreographed labor. A tunneler would lie on his back, driving a specialized spade into the soft blue clay with the immense power of his legs. A second man would immediately catch the dislodged earth in a sandbag, and a third would load it onto a trolley running on wooden rails to muffle the sound. All this excess soil, over 80,000 tons of it, was silently hauled to the surface only under the cover of darkness, where it was painstakingly scattered across the battlefield, or used to build up sandbag parapets to avoid creating any auspicious mounds that might be spotted by German aerial surveillance. Every moment underground was a duel against death. The greatest fear was the threat of German countermining. This became a tense cat-and-mouse game, with both sides using geophones, early stethoscopes, to listen for enemy activity. The British tunnelers would often pause, pressing their devices to the clay to listen for the faint, terrifying sounds of enemy picks digging toward them. A single careless sound, be it a tool drop, a cough, or even an unusually loud sigh, could give away their position and trigger a German countercharge, burying the entire team alive. Beyond the enemy, the Earth itself posed a constant threat, with risks of fire damp, carbon monoxide poisoning, and sudden tunnel collapses. This team of professionals dug beneath streams, around old drainage systems, and through the German countermines with ultimate precision. Because of these underground water systems, water often seeped through the clay walls, forcing pumps to run day and night to prevent flooding. Despite the danger and exhaustion, the network grew. After 18 months of relentless work, it was complete. 21 main tunnels, totaling 4.5 miles in length, snaked beneath the German lines. The engineering was a marvel, with galleries plunging from depths of 90 feet to about 300 feet, the longest running for more than a mile. These navigated geological obstacles and passed directly under the national hazards and German listening posts with astonishing precision. The tunnels were not the only marvel. Explosives were also in abundance. Crate after crate of ammonal, a powerful and remarkably stable high explosive, was carefully transported down into the darkness and stacked in deep chambers located beneath the enemy's most vital strongpoints. At Spaanbroekmolen, a critical high point on the ridge, a single chamber was packed with over 91,000 pounds of explosives. The mine at Saint-Éloi, the largest of the operation, contained 95,600 pounds. At Hill 60, a site already infamous for bitter fighting above, on land, 2 massive mines were prepared. It is said the amount of powder present beneath Hill 60 could eliminate an entire battalion. In total, nearly 1 million pounds of high explosives sat in the deep, silent chambers, fully wired and ready. The Germans, going about their daily routine of trench life, were completely oblivious to the subterranean arsenal lying just beneath their feet. Held at all costs. With the mines ready beneath German feet, General Herbert Plumer turned to orchestrating the battle itself. In June 1917, his Second Army would strike along a 17,000-yard front from Saint-Yves to Montsorel, advancing at around 3,000 yards in a single day, which was quite an ambitious goal by Western Front standards. Once the ridge was captured and held, the line could be advanced north during the summer offensive. This would be the opening phase of a larger campaign that would later be known as the Battle of Passchendaele. He knew the mines were a powerful opening act, but they would be useless without a flawlessly executed follow-up. This was to be a battle of absolute precision, a complex and brutal choreography involving 80,000 men, thousands of guns, and a handful of the new terrifying war machines called tanks. Plumer, a general who valued the lives of his men, left nothing to chance. His guiding principle was one of overwhelming force and exhaustive preparation, encapsulated in his stark directive that the Messines Ridge must be held at all costs. The preparations began with a symphony of destruction. Plumer amassed an unprecedented concentration of firepower with over 2,250 artillery pieces, one gun for every 7 yards of front. For a whole week leading up to the attack, this steel storm rained down on the German positions. Over 3.5 million shells pounded the ridge, systematically dismantling the enemy's defenses. This was not a random barrage. It was a planned demolition. Specific guns were tasked with cutting the intricate webs of barbed wire, others with smashing the concrete pillboxes and strongpoints, while heavy artillery batteries engaged in counter-battery fire, hunting and destroying the German guns that could threaten the advancing infantry. Some units were also tasked with filling the terrain with shells. Plumer's plan for his infantry was just as detailed. He had his leading divisions, including the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, rehearse the attack for weeks on end. Using detailed maps and aerial photographs, they built full-scale replicas of the German trench systems behind their own lines. Each platoon practiced its specific role, memorizing the layout of the trenches they were to capture and the exact locations of machine gun nests and dugouts. They were not merely soldiers sent into the fray. They were specialists trained for a specific, lethal task. This level of rehearsal was unprecedented at the time and attested to Plumer's commitment to minimizing casualties through preparation. In the final nights before the assault, the assembly trenches were dug, bringing the 80,000 Allied troops to within just a few hundred yards of the German front line. The men lay there in the dark, a vast, silent army waiting for the signal. They were so close they could hear the German sentries coughing and speaking in the trenches opposite them, completely unaware of the doom that lay beneath their feet and the tidal wave of men about to crash over them. Everything now hinged on a split second of timing. No time was to be lost, and the attack was to be carried out with utmost precision. The attack was set for 3:30 a.m. on the 7th of June. The first move would not be a whistle or a yell, but the very eruption of the earth itself. Fireworks at Messines. On that fateful day, the sky was filled with more than just the heavenly bodies. On June 7, 1917, just a half hour before dawn, the British artillery fire lifted at Messines Ridge. As the silence spread all over the front line, the waiting troops reportedly heard a nightingale singing. Then, at precisely 10 minutes past 3 a.m., the earth split open. The first detonation occurred beneath Hill 60, shattering the stillness with a deep, inhumanly rumbling roar. A split second later, the Caterpillar mine went off, then the ones at Middlestraat Farm, Kruisstraat, and Peckham. One after another, 21 mines erupted beneath the German lines in a rolling sequence that lasted barely 20 seconds. The soldiers present on both sides recalled that this felt like the end of the world. For a brief moment, the Western Front was at peace. Then, the appointed second arrived, and the world was torn apart and torn about by General Herbert. It did not begin with a single bang, but with a deep, soul-wrenching rumble that grew from the bowels of the earth. The ground began to tremble violently, not from the impact of shells, but from a force pushing upwards from below. After the first mine went off at Hill 60, the deafening sequence that lasted less than 20 seconds followed. Almost immediately, 19 of the 21 massive charges detonated. The very fabric of the continent seemed to tear open as 19 titanic geysers of fire, earth, and shattered German bodies erupted skyward, creating pillars of orange and red that lit up the pre-dawn sky. Men who witnessed it described it not as an explosion, but as an act of God, the judgment of God that threw the Messines Ridge into the Book of Revelations. The blast was the loudest man-made sound in history up to that point. The shockwave was felt for hundreds of miles. All the way in London, over 160 miles away, Prime Minister David Lloyd George reportedly heard the distant rumble from his study at 10 Downing Street. For the Allied soldiers in the trenches, the physical force was overwhelming. The ground heaved like a stormy sea, throwing men from their feet. The air pressure was so immense that it felt as though their lungs were being crushed, and many suffered from burst eardrums. In the initial moment of terror, As recalled by Private Patrick McGill of the London Irish Rifles, many soldiers believed the Germans had secretly pulled a reverse and sprung a mine on them. They thought it was the end point, and they were all about to be swallowed up in the bowels of the earth. For the German defenders on the ridge, there was no time for terror. There was only oblivion. It was the end. In an instant, an estimated 10,000 soldiers of the Bavarian divisions were annihilated. They were not merely killed, they were vaporized, dismembered or scattered like confetti, forever in tons of collapsing earth and concrete. Trenches, fortified dugouts, machine gun nests, and entire command posts simply ceased to exist. What had been a formidable, heavily defended ridge was transformed in the blink of an eye into a lunar landscape of overlapping monstrous shells, craters, and bodies. After the fireworks at Messines were over, with the ground now horrifically scarred and changed forever, the ridge lay open, and as the last echoes of the explosion faded, the signal came. The war whistles blew, and 80,000 men charged from their trenches into advance into the now near-barren battlefield. Scene versus scene. After the invasion of the battlefield by fireworks, it became a smoky, red, and destructive shadow of its former self. The dust, death-filled earth, and debris combined with the pre-dawn sky to reveal the Messines battlefield for what it really was, a place of death, a scene of almost biblical destruction. The thick clouds and time of day momentarily plunged the world into a darkness thick with choking dust and the stench of cordite. Seconds after the final mine erupted, whistles shrieked all along the line. This was the moment of truth. The infantry went over the top, advancing not into the expected storm of machine gun fire that had defined the war, but into a surreal and silent moonscape. The meticulously planned creeping artillery barrage began its advance, a moving wall of shellfire that shielded the infantry as they moved. The primary obstacle was not the enemy, but the very geography of the former battlefield that had just been loudly rewritten. Gigantic craters, some measuring over 200 feet across the ground and 40 feet deep, scarred the landscape. Men scrambled about their gaping holes or slid down their treacherous, crumbling sides, all while navigating a bewildering maze of pulverized trenches and vaporized strongpoints that have "graveyard" written all over them. For the German soldiers who survived, the scene was one of pure, unimaginable horror. Their world had ceased to exist in the span of 20 seconds. In those 20 seconds, they had no time to assimilate what type of surprise party they had just been served. Dugouts and concrete fortifications that were once considered impenetrable had been tossed into the air like pebbles. An estimated 40,000 men were killed in total, many immediately ceasing to exist, and many buried forever under thousands of tons of earth, left to die slowly. The survivors were shattered. They were found wandering, many bleeding from the ears and nose, their minds broken by the sheer force of the blasts. Allied soldiers reported encountering German troops who were littered across the battlefield, offering no resistance as they were taken prisoner. They were ghosts on a dead battlefield. This psychological and physical obliteration of the enemy lines ensured that the initial advance of the Allied troops was astonishingly successful. The New Zealanders on the right flank and the 36th Ulster Division on the left stormed and captured the shattered village of Messines in a fraction of the expected time. In a pivotal moment of history, the Irish-based Catholic 16th Division fought alongside the Protestant 36th Division to seize the village of Ychady. This joint action would have been unthinkable in the domestic political conflict. Along the entire front, the first objectives were seized within a few hours. The German front line, which had stood unyielding for nearly 3 years, had not just been breached, it had been erased from existence. Of the German forces stationed on the ridge, only about 7,200 managed to survive the blast. Where earlier battles seemed chaotic, mud-choked and ever slow, Plumer's attack was multifaceted, flexible, and fast. His meticulous attention to detail and cautious approach had earned him the affectionate respect of his soldiers, as well as hero status in the British military ranks. Most importantly, the capture of Messines Ridge was a major success for the British, taking place at one of the most critical points of the war. But this perfect victory contained the seed of disaster. British High Command, drunk on success, had convinced itself it had found the formula to win the war. Just weeks later, they'd launch a massive offensive at another Belgian village called Passchendaele, expecting to repeat Messines' success on a grand scale. At Passchendaele, there would be no associative mining, no years of preparation, and no Plumer. The offensive began in late July with ambitious goals: break through German lines, capture the Belgian ports, and win the war. But instead, the heaviest rains in 3 decades turned the battlefield into an iron swamp. By November, after 325,000 casualties, the Allies had captured the village of Passchendaele. By then, it had deteriorated to become a pile of bricks sitting on a 5-mile stretch of wasteland that nobody wanted. Today, the craters of Messines remain. The Spanbroek-Molen blast site, now called the Pool of Peace, remains a serene, water-filled site, carved from one of the most violent minutes in history. Each year, farmers still unearth rusted shells from that week in June, and buried beneath their fields, 2 mines remain unfired. They hold over 190,000 pounds of ammonite, still wired, still alive, but too dangerous to remove and too unstable to detonate. This century-old weapon remains, frozen in time. But that makes you think, with all this bloodshed, why were they fighting? What was so important about the Belgian pathway? What really was the Battle of Messines? Why the Belgian marshlands? In April 1917, the French commander-in-chief, General Robert Nivelle, launched a massive assault at the Chemin des Dames, promising a decisive breakthrough that would win the war in 48 hours. He mentioned that he had seen a winning formula. The attack was a catastrophic failure, resulting in over 187 French casualties for minimal territorial gain. The sheer scale of the losses, combined with the complete inability to achieve any strategic objectives, had a devastating effect on the morale of the French soldiers. This led directly to the French Army mutinies of 1917. Beginning in May, units across the French Army began to refuse orders, desert, and protest the suicidal tactics. At its peak, nearly half of the French infantry divisions on the Western Front were affected. This meant that the French Army, the most significant Allied force on the continent, was effectively paralyzed and unable to launch any further large-scale offensive operations for the remainder of the year. This collapse placed the entire strategic burden of the war on the British force. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, the British commander, now faced a critical situation. He had to launch a major British offensive for 2 primary reasons. First, it was essential to keep German forces heavily engaged in Flanders to prevent them from discovering the French army's weakness and launching a potentially war-ending attack against the demoralized French lines. Second, a decisive victory was needed to secure a launching point for the long-planned Third Battle of Ypres, later known as Passchendaele. The Messines Ridge dominated the southern flank of the Ypres salient, and its capture was a non-negotiable prerequisite for any further advance. The battle was therefore a crucial preliminary step towards stabilizing the front and maintaining Allied pressure on Germany. This battle cost both sides so much. The issue of life and death was a critical point in the Great War. But what was the aftermath like? What fruits did the fertilizer bombs yield? The aftermath of Messines. While the Battle of Messines is widely regarded as a tactical masterpiece, its ultimate strategic significance remains a subject of intense debate among historians and similar scholars. From the German perspective, the defeat was unambiguous, without a single definitive meaning. In his post-war writings, General Ludendorff admitted the British victory cost the German army dearly and drained crucial reserves. Field Marshal von Hindenburg described the losses as heavy and regretted not having evacuated the ridge beforehand. At the same time, General von Kuhl would later label it one of the worst German tragedies of the war. This assessment is echoed by modern military historians, who describe the battle as a significant victory for the British and a disaster for the German army, which was later forced into a long period of anxious waiting. However, the legacy of the battle is complicated by subsequent developments. Critics like Basil Liddell Hart argued that the stunning success at Messines dangerously inflated expectations for the Third Battle of Ypres. Because the circumstances of the 2 operations were vastly different, the attempt to apply similar methods at Passchendaele, without the same level of surprise or meticulous preparation, contributed to the failure and horrific casualties that followed. Former Prime Minister David Lloyd George dismissed the battle as a mere aperitif, a prelude to the tragedy to come. Even Field Marshal Haig, in his own dispatches, refrained from excessive speaking, carefully framing the operation as a successful preliminary, essential for securing the flank before the main offensive at Ypres could begin. This points to the central controversy of the battle, the 47-day operational pause between the victory at Messines and the start of Passchendaele. While some historians attribute this delay to overconfidence or strategic indecision, a more practical explanation lies in the very success of the Messines bombardment. The mines and the 3.5 million shells had not just destroyed the German defenses, they had obliterated the landscape itself. The ridge was a chaotic wasteland of overlapping craters and pulverized earth. Before the main offensive could be launched, British engineers had to perform the colossal task of rebuilding the infrastructure across this devastated terrain, constructing new roads, laying railway lines, and digging gun emplacements to support the next push. Recent historical analysis concludes that this logistical necessity, rather than a strategic blunder, was the primary reason for the pause. The success at Messines was so absolute that it created a wasteland that had to be tamed before it could be used, casting a long and tragic shadow over the subsequent campaign. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.